must control our destiny. Self-determination, self-determination. Kujichagulia, self-determination. So as we educate our children, tell the truth. Let us always think about the millions who came before and sacrificed their lives so that our mighty people would survive. And the glory of our past we soon revive, yeah. Every day we face a challenge. You and I, our future's hanging in the balance. So we must do whatever can be done. We must not be dependent on anyone. That way we can be sure that our interests are secure.
Ha resuelto el capitalismo, no ha resuelto ningún problema. Ha saqueado el mundo, ha dejado toda esta pobreza, ha creado estilos de vida y modelos de consumo que son incompatibles con las realidades. Han envenenado las aguas, los mares, quiero decir los ríos, los lagos, los mares, la atmósfera, la tierra. Han creado el despilfarro más increíble. Y yo siempre cito un ejemplo, imagínate que cada chino tuviera un automóvil, o quisiera tener un automóvil, cada uno de los 1.100 millones de chinos. O que cada uno de los indios, que son alrededor de 800 millones, quisiera tener un automóvil y este método, este estilo de vida. Y que África hiciera lo mismo. Y que casi 450 millones de latinoamericanos hicieran lo mismo. ¿Cuánto duraría el petróleo? ¿Cuánto duraría el gas? ¿Cuánto durarían los recursos naturales? ¿Qué quedaría de la capa de ozono? ¿Qué quedaría del oxígeno sobre la Tierra? ¿Qué pasaría con el dióxido de carbono? Y todos estos fenómenos que están cambiando la ecología del mundo, están cambiando la Tierra. Están haciendo cada vez más difícil la vida en nuestro planeta. ¿Es que el capitalismo acaso le ha dado al mundo un modelo de vida, un modelo de sociedad? ¿No debiéramos pensar en cosas más racionales, como sería la educación de toda la población, la alimentación, la salud, una vivienda decorosa, una cultura elevada? ¿Acaso el capitalismo nos ha, con sus leyes ciegas, su egoísmo como principio, nos ha dado a nosotros un modelo, nos ha enseñado un camino? ¿O el camino de la humanidad va a ser el camino trazado por el capitalismo hasta ahora? Se puede hablar de crisis del socialismo, pero hay una crisis mayor del capitalismo que no tiene salida y que no tiene soluciones para los grandes problemas de la humanidad en todos los sentidos, tanto los problemas humanos como los problemas sociales, como los problemas ecológicos. Y no se puede seguir viviendo en virtud de leyes ciegas. El hombre debiera tener la posibilidad de programar su propio desarrollo, de planificar su vida, de emplear los recursos naturales y humanos con racionalidad, y no esta carrera loca que no ha conducido a nada y no conducirá a ninguna parte. Porque ¿qué ha resuelto el capitalismo?
All right, I think you can hear me. Hi, okay. Greetings, everybody. Thank you so much for joining. Welcome to bi-weekly at best Pan-African News. It's still called Weekly Pan-African News, but we are in fact doing this show on the second and fourth Thursday of each month instead of every single Thursday. So it's not even weekly anymore, y'all. We haven't got around to picking a new name yet, but it's very good to see you all. Welcome, welcome, everybody. Hey, Marion, thanks for helping me when I was facilitating the conference, and there was like lipstick all over my teeth. Marion came in the DMs and it was like, girl, there's lipstick all over your teeth, and it was great. Appreciate you. Also, happy birthday. Greeting, Deborah. Greeting, Obioma. I see that you asked what the song was. It is actually the song Kuga Chagalia by Kwame, Steve, and Chavanduka. Chavanduka is a Central Committee member of the All African People's Revolutionary Party and a cadre in the Illinois chapter, and also an extremely accomplished performer. That was her singing. Again, the song is Kuga Chagalia by Kwame, Steve, and Chavanduka. So thanks for asking that. Greetings, Ricky. Greetings, Emma. So good to see you all. This is Bi-Weekly Pan-African News. I am your comrade, Onya Sanwu, with the New Mexico chapter of the All African People's Revolutionary Party. And this is the show we started way back in the beginning of the pandemic, like 2 years ago at this point. We were like, we want to keep building with our people. We want to keep learning with y'all, but we can't do in-person events. What do we do? And this show is like one of many ideas that we came up with. Also, you may have noticed, usually I'm like shrouded in darkness because I had a really bad webcam, but I realized that you can get webcams with light correction. So I got one, and it's much better, but there seems to be like a delay in my video. So let me know if you have any issues like seeing me or hearing me, or if it gets like choppy, and I'll see if I can fix it. But hopefully this light correction is working for y'all. I can show you, as a matter of fact, that I'm wearing my Forward Ever Shop swag. This is my One United Africa hoodie from the APRP's official merch store, the Forward Ever Shop. You should get one. Here you go. I just put it in the chat. But yeah, so hopefully you can see me clearly. It's a little bit choppy. Okay. Hold on. Yeah, like there's like a delay on my video to the software. And I think it's because I have like too many windows open, but I like closed all my windows. So I don't know what to do. But let's see if I can just adjust the bit rate and maybe it'll be a little bit better. But yeah, thank you for letting me know, Deborah. But anywho, hopefully that smooths out after I adjust the settings. I am wearing pants, Erica. I'm wearing my Boom Boom shorts. But I am wearing pants. I wouldn't have turned down the webcam if I was not wearing pants. It's not that kind of show. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but this is not what we're trying to do today. But anywho, so if you're a frequent watcher of the show, then you know that we always start off with a couple of things. First and foremost, the who we are and what is this, which I just did. This is Weekly Pan-African News. I'm Onya Sanwu with the All African People's Revolutionary Party. The All African People's Revolutionary Party is a revolutionary Pan-African socialist mass political party based in Africa, founded in Africa with chapters throughout the African world, with the political objective of Pan-Africanism, which we define as one unified socialist Africa. The other thing that we always do at the beginning of the show is that we want to call it an ancestor, a revolutionary ancestor. And the reason why we do that is because we, as revolutionary African people fighting for the liberation and unification of Africa, are standing on the shoulders of the contributions made by many generations of people that came before us, who struggled, who sacrificed, who strategized in order to advance the liberation of African people and to advance justice all around the world. So I would not be here talking to y'all without the ancestors, without the people that came before me. It would just simply not be possible for me to do this work, for any of us to do this work. And so we have to honor them. We have to lift them up because we know this backwards capitalist society is not going to do it for us. So let's honor our heroes because they are going to lie on them, they being the enemy. So the ancestor we want to call in today is none other than Robert Mangaliso Sobukwe. He was born in December 5th, 1942, he was a teacher, a scholar, a lawyer, a secretary at one point of an African National Congress branch, but split from the ANC in 1958 to help form the Pan-Africanist Congress of Azania, or the PAC, and he was also the PAC's first president. He was also a longtime political prisoner who was tortured by the apartheid regime for the so-called crime of fighting for the liberation of African people in Azania. But really important thing to know about why the PAC formed, why that split happened, was actually explained to me a couple of years ago, back in 2019, I think. We celebrated the 50th anniversary of the African People's Revolutionary Party with a delegation to Ghana. The delegation was made up of APIP organizers from Africa and throughout the United States. It was also made up of comrades from the Amilcar Cabral Ideological Institute in Nigeria, comrades from AZAPO, the Azanian People's Organization, obviously in Azania, and comrades from the Pan-Africanist Congress of Azania, actually one of whom has been on the show a couple of times, Odie. Shout out to Odie. But I remember asking, the PAC comrades about like what they thought of the ANC, and they kept being like, charterists. And I was like, what is a charterist? And they were like, if you read the Freedom Charter, which is like kind of like the founding document or like the guiding document of the ANC, the very first line of the Freedom Charter says, the land in South Africa belongs to those who work it, black or white. But how did the white folks get to South Africa? The white folks got to South Africa by stealing the land, by committing genocide against indigenous African people, by engaging in systematic repression of those indigenous African people to maintain their domination over the land. And so in that founding document, in that Freedom Charter, where it says the land belongs to those who work it, black or white, we're just like completely papering over the contradiction of settler colonialism. Like to this day, European settlers still control the majority of the land in Azania, 80%, I think, of the land in Azania. So what kind of sense does it make to be like, it doesn't matter how we got here, all that genocide, all that land theft, building reservations, building Bantustan's, the pass laws, the Jim Crow style laws, like none of that matters. We just have to focus on now and split the land equally between the black folks and the white folks. And Robert Sobukwe and the PAC were like, nah, this is our land. We don't want to like engage in genocide against Europeans, but we are going to fight for an Azania that's controlled politically by the indigenous people who are the Africans. We're not going to renounce our claim to this land because the Europeans just happen to be here. Absolutely not. So that was kind of like the underlying reason for why the Robert Sobukwe and his comrades split from the ANC to form the PAC in 1958. And in that same conversation with the PAC comrade, I was asking him, like, what do you think about the EFF, the Economic Freedom Fighters? And he was like, charterists. And I was like, okay. And he was like, they uphold, and they're very open about this, they uphold the Freedom Charter. They uphold that line saying that the land in Azania should be split equally between the settlers and the indigenous people. And I was like, huh. And like up until that point, there had been like a lot of confusion in the Western African left about, what position to take on the EFF because they were very militant appearing. But he was like, when it comes down to it, they're still upholding this revisionist line. They're still upholding this line that says we don't have to deal with the fundamental contradiction of settler colonialism. So how radical could they be? And so it was very, very helpful for me to understand the political difference between PAC and the ANC, because it then helped me understand the political differences between all kinds of organizations in Azania. So that's what charterist means. That's why the PAC split happened. And I'll end this ancestor segment with a quote from Sobukwe, where he says, we want to make the African people conscious of the fact that they have to win their own liberation, rely on themselves to carry on relentless and determined struggle, instead of relying on court cases and negotiations on their behalf by sympathetic whites. That's again Robert Sobukwe talking about the necessity of African people leading the struggle for our own liberation. We can't just be like, hey, allies, can you fight for us? No, we have to fight for our dignity. We have to fight for our land. We have to win this struggle for ourselves. No one else is going to be able to do it for us. So again, the ancestor today was Robert Mangaliso Sobukwe, first president of the Pan-African Congress of Azania, great hero of the national liberation struggle of Africa. So thanks. And then the last thing that we always do in the introduction, and I also started laughing during the quote because Ricky was like, "Are you wearing pants?" I don't know why I find that so funny. But anywho, someone's asking, do the settlers work the land? If they just hold the hand, but the Africans work the land, it belongs to those who work the land, i.e. Africans, right? In fact, the settlers don't work the land. The settlers just monopolize the land and then exploit African people on their own land to do the labor. So that's actually correct. But the Freedom Charter explicitly says black or white, which is wild to me. It's wild. Like, it's a settler colony. It's a settler state. What happened to giving the land back? Why is that the exception? It makes no sense. But yeah, understanding that fundamental political difference is like a key to understanding the political landscape in Azania. Like, understand the land is still stolen, understand European settlers still control the majority of it, and then analyze the political organizations by how they approach that contradiction. So shout out to Odie and the other PhD comrades on that 50th anniversary delegation for breaking that down so clearly. So clearly, it helps so much. But the last thing that we always do in the intro is a land acknowledgement. I am speaking to y'all from occupied Tiwa territory, also known as the city of Albuquerque, New Mexico. This land rightfully belongs to the Tiwa Pueblo. The Tiwa Pueblo is still here. They are fighting for their land back. They are fighting for their water back. They are fighting to end extraction of oil and natural gas on their lands. And all over the Western Hemisphere, land was stolen actually by the cousins of the European settlers that stole the land in Azania. It was actually the same little group of people that did this all over the world. So land was stolen all over the Western Hemisphere, and all over the Western Hemisphere, Africa, occupied Palestine, Australia, Northern Ireland, indigenous peoples are fighting for their land back. Land was taken, land will be returned. That is a promise. We are not just saying it just to say it. We are saying it because the necessity of fighting against the capitalist system requires a process of decolonization, requires indigenous people getting their land back by any means necessary. So it is a political strategy. It is a promise. It is not just something we're saying just to say. So that's the intro. I hope y'all enjoyed it. I kept my composure mostly. We are getting a show. Not that kind of show. Okay, so the other thing that we always do on this program, every single episode, is that we always have a political education segment. And this is not just something that New Mexico chapter does. This is something that every single APRP chapter all around the world does. You are not going to go to an APRP event and not get some aspect of political education. We do this because we understand, as Ancestor Malcolm X said, you cannot organize a sleeping people. You must wake them up, and then you get some action. And so political education is how we wake up. Political education is how, I feel like it's a continuous process of waking up. First, it's like Inception, where you think you woke up from the dream, and then you realize you're still dreaming, so you have to wake up again. Like, I feel like that's the process of conscientation, where you're like, you're constantly peeling back the layers of this society, understanding how things work together, understanding why are things working the way they are, understanding how history got to this point. Like, it's a constant waking up process for the rest of your life, and I would not have it any other way. But the political education topic on the show this week is a subject that I have a lot of thoughts about, so I'm going to try to keep the show within a reasonable time box, but it's a big topic. We are going to be talking about how the system of global capitalism is driving environmental destruction, is the direct cause of catastrophic climate change that is threatening the human race and a lot of other forms of life on this planet. It's threatening the future of the planet itself. We're going to talk about why that's happening. We're going to talk about what that looks like. We're going to talk about what we can do about it. I want to begin this conversation or this topic by saying that a lot of climate change conversations, particularly in the United States, have an intense pessimism, have this permeating sense of dread and doom, there's nothing we can do, we're screwed, there's no point to fighting, it's just over. And I understand why that happens, particularly in the United States, because when you look at the people in power, like Joe Biden, like the Democrats, like the Republicans, like the leaders of these transnational corporations that are headquartered in the United States, you see no action whatsoever. You see them like acknowledging the problem symbolically, saying someone should do something, and then really not following through in any way, shape, or form on the kind of drastic actions that are going to be necessary to actually address this problem. We see like a lot of lip service, very little action. And so if you're a person that understands what's happening, if you're a person who understands like the magnitude of the threat of catastrophic climate change, if you see the people in charge doing nothing and you don't understand that something else is possible, then I could see why you would get very pessimistic. I would see why you're going to be like, we're all going to die. But I want to very intentionally in this conversation say that we cannot afford the climate doom. All is not actually lost. As we speak, there are socialist nations pursuing a more rational strategy. As we speak, there are better ways of living in existence right now. What that means is that the problem is not that we're doomed, that there's no hope. The problem is that we are not sufficiently organized to carry out the actions that we need to address this problem. It doesn't mean we can never get that organized. It just means that right now we're not. So that means distinctly there is hope. There is something we can do. We're just not doing it yet. So I just wanted to say that like throughout this conversation, we're going to be talking about intense stuff. We're going to be talking about what climate change actually looks like. It's going to be it's probably going to be depressing at first, but understand that a better world is possible. We just have to build it. There's no excuse whatsoever, particularly in the belly of the beast, to just be nihilistic about this, to just be like, there's no hope, because there is, and we'll talk about that. So starting off the conversation, to be clear, catastrophic climate change is not something that's coming. Catastrophic climate change is something that is here right now as we speak. It is already happening. People are already dying. Mass migrations driven by climate change are already happening. Like catastrophic climate change is here. It's not on the way. It is here. So in terms of where we are as a species, as a planet, in the latest 2021 reports, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, also known as the IPCC, found that the Earth has reached an average temperature increase of 1.1 degrees Celsius. Most of Africa, however, is close to breaching what the IPCC has previously described as the safe 1.5 degree Celsius mark in terms of temperature increases. The consequences of that we can see all around us. Pollution and resource extraction have threatened 1 million animal and plant species with extinctions. We are seeing hotter, longer, drier summers. We are seeing forest fires engulfing the entire western half of the United States on a regular basis, on an annual basis. We are seeing stronger, much more destructive hurricanes happening more frequently. We are seeing stronger, much more destructive blizzards and cold weather incidents happening more frequently. So we can look around, we can look outside and see this is happening. The IPCC has previously said that a 2 degrees Celsius temperature increase would exacerbate extreme weather, rising sea levels, and diminishing Arctic sea ice, cause coral bleaching and loss of ecosystems, among other impacts. So we are already at a 1.1 degrees Celsius increase in most of the world. Most of Africa has already seen a 1.5 degrees Celsius increase. And at 2 degrees Celsius is when the really horrible shit starts happening. So we are right there. Additionally, the IPCC has said that if global warming continues to reach 3 degrees Celsius, which was previously projected to happen in 2060, and 5.7 degrees Celsius projected to happen in 2100, based on what we're currently doing, then the human race will almost certainly go extinct. So this is the situation we find ourselves in. 1.1 degrees Celsius increase around the whole world, 1.5 already in most of Africa. 2 degrees Celsius increase means the shit will hit the fan, and 3 degrees Celsius increase, which we are on track to do, means the extinction of the human race. And again, all of these statistics are coming from reports released by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or the IPCC. So like I said, catastrophic climate change is not something that's on the way. Catastrophic climate change is something that's already here. So let's talk about what that actually looks like. In Africa, there are 54 countries on the African continent. All together, those countries represent merely 2% of global carbon emissions. However, half of Africa's population, 1.2 billion people, have no access to electricity. I was reading the other day about how in Niger, over 40% of the population has no electricity in their houses, but uranium looted from Niger by France powers nuclear energy in France that provides electricity for like the majority of France's population. So this is the situation in Africa. Even though the entire rest of the world runs on resources exploited from Africa, like that uranium, like oil, like bauxite, like coltan, African people do not have access to the development that's happening on their backs. So half of Africa's population has no access to electricity. At the same time, extreme climate events are increasing in frequency in Africa. We are seeing droughts. We are seeing cyclones that flood places like Nigeria for months at a time. We are seeing floods in the Horn of Africa. We are seeing desertification in the Sahel. We are seeing the consequences of extreme climate events causing migration, causing shortages in access to food, causing all sorts of extremely serious consequences. Meanwhile, the entire continent of Africa is responsible for just 2% of global carbon emissions. The countries that are looting Africa, that are continuing to mine and drill and loot African resources, are causing the problem, and Africa is suffering the consequences. This is going to be a recurring theme throughout this conversation. In Afghanistan, the U.S. recently so-called ended its war in Afghanistan. It was a hot mess. It's not actually over. As the U.S. was leaving, or when the U.S. occupied Afghanistan in its so-called war on terror, they basically destroyed Afghanistan's government. They left it with no functioning state, and they made that nation extremely dependent on foreign aid in order to survive on a day-to-day basis. But on the way out, the United States, as it does, applied additional sanctions to Afghanistan, which, as we speak, are making it extremely difficult for that nation to get the foreign aid it needs to function on a day-to-day basis, to meet the needs of the citizens of Afghanistan. So the United States destroyed the nation, made them dependent on aid, and then as they were leaving, applied sanctions to make it impossible for Afghanistan to get the aid it needs. And you can read about this in the article that I'm going to put in the chat. At the same time as this is happening, war destroyed the country's infrastructure. The United States destroyed the functioning government, then applied sanctions so that government couldn't get aid. At the same time as this is happening, Afghanistan is suffering through what is known as a mega drought. It is getting worse. It has lasted months. And Afghanistan, like the food people eat, its entire economy is extremely dependent on people being able to engage in subsistence farming. But when rain does not come, when the temperatures rise, what do you think happens to the yields of farms? They're not able to produce the same amount of crops. They're not able to produce the same amount of food. And so now, again, under U.S. sanctions, Afghanistan is experiencing a major crisis that has been exacerbated by climate change. Farmers in Afghanistan cannot grow enough food to feed people because there's no water and it's too hot, y'all. So they get you coming and they get you going. They destroyed the nation for no reason, because the war on terror was a farce meant to extend U.S. imperialist control across the world. Then, after the nation was bombed to shit and completely dependent on foreign aid, the U.S. applied sanctions to punish them. And now, catastrophic climate change has caused droughts and heat waves that make it so these people can't grow food. This is the situation we see in climate change caused by the capitalist system being exacerbated intentionally by imperialism and plunging this entire nation, which has been occupied for 20 years, into crisis. So this is another example of how the capitalist system not only has created the problem of catastrophic climate change, but is actively making it worse with imperialism. So I put 2 articles in the chat for you to check out more about this, about how the US sanctions on Afghanistan are making it impossible for them to get foreign aid, and how droughts and heat waves are making it impossible for them to grow food, and how Afghanistan is now stuck in the middle trying to figure out how to feed its people on a basic level. And then let's talk about climate change in the United States, because oftentimes people will talk about climate change like it's happening in other places, but in fact, it's unfolding in the United States as well. Like I already mentioned, like the entire western half of the United States is on fire for like 5 months out of the year, every single year. I used to live in Portland, Oregon, and there would be days where you couldn't see like 3 feet in front of your face because there was so much smoke. People with asthma could not leave the house. They'd have to like plug the gaps under their doors, plug the gaps in their windows to be able to breathe inside of their homes. And this was a condition that was lasting for months. This was a few years ago. Now the fires in the west coast of the United States are even bigger. They are frequently consuming entire neighborhoods with no kind of relief plan whatsoever to deal with the folks that lost their homes, never mind the people who are suffocating inside of their homes because of the smoke. So that's just one example of what climate change looks like in the United States. We can also see these stronger, more frequent hurricanes. Another example, the much colder and much more intense winter storms in the Northeast. As another example, here in the Southwest, I live in Tiwa territory, like I said. It was 60 degrees for most of December. No snow in sight. Like today, I think it's 60 degrees. This is extremely unseasonable weather. So we can see in the day-to-day that climate change is absolutely happening in the United States, but it's never really discussed in the long term. And so to talk about what that looks like, there's like this really incredible ProPublica article about the impacts of climate change in the United States. Let me put this in the chat. And I remember when this came out, and it was like barely a blip on the radar. Like it wasn't really discussed in like mainstream press, which, you know, they don't really ever be talking about useless or useful things. And I knew immediately why that was, because if you check out this article, if you check out, it's a resource. They're talking about like in region by region and oftentimes like city by city in the United States, what is going to happen as a result of the current projection of warming trends under catastrophic climate change. And they talk about how, for example, in most of the Southeast and a lot of the Southwest United States, in about 20 to 30 years, it's going to be too hot to grow a remarkable amount of things. They talk about how the sea level is going to rise in U.S. coastal cities to an extent where people are not going to be able to live in those places anymore. They talk about how these forest fires that are engulfing the western half of the United States for half the year are going to spread to more and more places, not just California and Oregon and Nevada, but to the entire western half of the United States. They talk about how the combination of rising temperatures and rising humidity are going to make an increasing number of places unlivable, particularly for elders and disabled folks. They talk about how there is no plan whatsoever to deal with the migrant crisis that is going to result when these areas are too hot and humid to live in. So I definitely recommend this article because it gets really granular at taking a look at what climate change is going to do in the United States. And this shows you a couple of things. First, it shows you that this is not something people are going to be able to escape with wealth. Second of all, it shows you that even though there's like the data exists, the science exists, It's very clear what's going to happen. There is actually no long-term plan to address this for the masses of people in the United States. You are on your own. When a forest fire burns down your house in California, if you don't have insurance, you're just screwed. When a hurricane floods out your neighborhood in New Orleans or southeast Florida, if you don't have good insurance, you're just screwed. If you can't afford to evacuate, good luck to you. There is no plan coming from the state on a federal or state level to address that situation. And what this ProPublica report shows is that more and more people are going to find themselves facing those kinds of consequences of climate change. And again, we are going to be on our own. And also, if we think about the fact that the majority of the US food supply is coming from places where it's going to be too hot to grow a number of staple crops, what do you think is going to happen to the price of food? What do you think is going to happen to access to food? So even if you aren't in the regions that are not going to be are going to become unlivable, you are still going to feel the serious consequences of the lack of organized action on climate change in the United States. But I don't want to suggest that the US empire is doing nothing to prepare for climate change. What I'm actually saying is they're going to do nothing for you. When it comes to these corporations, and when it comes to the empire's military in particular, they are actually planning. The US military has engaged in a number of studies, has asked for more funding, is talking about climate change as a national security issue, is getting additional budgets to address climate change. So the US military is getting ready in the United States and all around the world. But when it comes to your food, when it comes to your housing, when it comes to your family, there is no plan. It shows you right away where the priorities of the US empire lie. And you can check out this article from the US Army talking about how they're preparing for climate change so you can see what I'm talking about. So your family, your grandma, your kids, they're like, may the odds be ever in your favor. Go fuck yourself. The US empire, the military, they are on top of it. They got the funding, they got the planning, they got the science. They are ready. They are prepared to make sure that the US empire's military will continue with its activities of genocide and terror and looting unabated. No interruption. But when it comes to your family, good luck, if that. Also, the Biden administration, Biden signed an executive order, I think like yesterday, calling for the US government to be converted to like completely green energy by like 2050. He's talking about how all the cars have to be electric cars, how they want to use like solar power, how they basically just want to create a sustainable empire. And again, when it comes to like the day-to-day people, masses of poor working class people, regular ass people trying to survive this caused by the capitalist system the US empire upholds, they're like, we are going to do nothing. Not only are we going to do nothing, but we're going to actively make it worse by continuing to drill for oil, by continuing to extract natural gas, by continuing to tear up indigenous people's land, poison the water. They're going to keep doing all that, but they're also going to make all the cars in the government electric, I guess. I don't know, dog. Let me stop swearing. But it's wild because this is how capitalism approaches climate change. It's a very good example because the US military and the US empire in general are the greatest net polluters on the face of the planet. Masses of people from Africa to Tiwa territory are suffering the consequences of these decisions that were not made by them, are currently living through the consequences of catastrophic climate change, and the response of the US empire is to continue to drill for fossil fuels, continue to actively destroy the planet, and then convert all the government cars to electric cars and be like, we're doing something, right? Like, this is what they do. They create the problem and then pose us the solution. And the solution they put forward is a bunch of nonsense. It's nonsense. It's nonsense. Like, what is all of the cars in the U.S. government being electric gonna do if the U.S. military is still putting jet fuel into the water supply? If the U.S. U.S. corporations are still drilling for oil in sacred sites like Chaco Canyon? Like, if the extractivism and environmental destruction is continuing unchecked to maintain the power of the U.S. empire and the position of the U.S. empire, then what does it matter if the White House, if the Secret Service has all electric cars? Like, what? What? And then the next thing I want to talk about is how the capitalist system, the U.S. empire, puts all of this money and rhetoric and these bills and what have you into pushing for a so-called like green revolution. And meanwhile, the materials that are needed to manufacture those electric cars, to manufacture those solar panels, to facilitate the transition to a so-called green economy are still being extracted from the earth in places like the Congo that are being devastated by imperialism. So you got green cars and, you know, Washington, D.C. and San Francisco and strip mining in the Congo. Like, how does that? It doesn't cancel each other out. It makes no sense. It makes no sense. And like I mentioned, you know, Biden campaign, that man was like bald-faced lying for the entirety of 2020, just like lying and playing in y'all's faces. And some of us could see it, but y'all were trying to listen, and now he's just like fully masked off. And it's really hard not to be like, I told you so. But one of the things he campaigned on was like listening to the science on COVID-19 and listening to the science on climate change. He was going to be an environmentally friendly president. Like, that's what these people were trying to tell me. And I was like, nah. So he comes in and immediately starts handing out drilling permits like they're candy. He has now authorized more drilling projects than Donald Trump. This is a fact. Look it up right now. Biden has authorized more drilling than Donald Trump. He's only 2 years in, y'all. It's going to get worse. So, like, he's putting out these executive orders talking about we need a sustainable empire while actively still drilling for oil while failing on every measure to meet any of the commitments made to address climate change. It's so bananas. It's so bananas. But yeah. Oh yeah, and the other thing. So I was recently reading an article about how after Hurricane Maria, which destroyed Puerto Rico is supposed to be a so-called U.S. state, but it's really just a colony of the United States. And so when Hurricane Maria hit, the United States had no interest whatsoever in providing any kind of relief effort that was going to address the conditions on that island. And so unfortunately, a lot of Puerto Ricans were forced to flee, and a lot of them ended up in the United States, particularly in places like Central Florida. And what that ended up like, it was like thousands of Puerto Ricans, I believe. 40,000 Puerto Ricans were forced to flee Puerto Rico and ended up settling throughout the United States, most of them in Florida. And what ended up happening was a demographic shift in the region in Florida where they ended up. They switched them from like red to blue and immediately got people into office. So there's already like climate refugees within the U.S. empire. Thousands of people forced to flee their homes because of natural disasters created by catastrophic climate change, which is itself driven by capitalism and imperialism. So we're going to see that continue to happen. People are going to be forced to flee where they've lived for long times to places in the United States. It's very interesting. And I wouldn't necessarily qualify that, like the circumstances that led to those folks having to leave their home were negative and unacceptable, but the demographic shift in Central Florida is extremely interesting to me because I feel like that can be exploited by the left, but that's another conversation. So yeah, climate migration is already happening all over the world, including in the United States. And again, this is a consequence of the environmental destruction created by capitalism and imperialism, and how capitalism and imperialism already is making these places unlivable for the people living there. So that's what climate change looks like in a few places in Africa, which we'll talk about more, in Afghanistan, and in the United States itself. Now let's talk about how the capitalist and imperialist system is the problem posing as the so-called solution to climate change itself. And let's talk about that by talking about COP26, COP26, the climate change conference of parties held in Glasgow, England last month. It is organized by the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. I think it happens like quarterly or something like that, but COP26 just happened in Glasgow. It was a summit of imperialist leaders. It was completely controlled by imperialist powers, and so it was an absolute farce, as these meetings tend to be. These imperialist countries come, they take pictures with each other, they make a lot of like grand speeches, they talk about how they understand that this is an existential threat, and they're definitely going to do something this time, and then they go home and do nothing. So the UNFCCC, which is again the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which organizes the COP conferences, has allowed powerful governments to essentially threaten poor countries into submission. They'll go after African nations, they'll go after Southeast Asian nations, talk about your emissions, talk about you can't use fossil fuels. Meanwhile, they're drilling for oil all over the planet. They had, through their inaction, guaranteed certain misery for millions of people, hundreds of millions of people, particularly in Africa, in the global south over the next 20 years. They have, through their inaction, permitted oil, mining, agricultural, logging, aviation, fishing, and other corporations to continue with environmentally destructive activities unfettered. All over the world, these imperialist nations are allowing these corporations to continue to destroy the planet. They are opening up even more areas for drilling. They are opening up even more areas for mining. They are doing this knowing the science on climate change and knowing what's coming and what's already here. They are still allowing that to happen while claiming from the other side of their mouths to be fighting climate change. At these conferences, there are many, many commitments made, like I mentioned, that are never followed through on. As an example, developed countries, imperialist countries, pledge to contribute $100 billion per year to a climate fund organized by the UNFCCC. And all of those nations have failed to provide that money to that climate fund with no consequences. Because they'll say, we're going to lower emissions by this percentage. We're going to give this money to this fund. We're going to stop drilling. They'll say this at the COP conferences, and then they'll go back to their home nations and do jack shit, continue to drill, and there's no consequences. They can say whatever they want. It's not actually binding. There is no way to actually enforce these commitments. It's just not happening. So they keep having these meetings, jerk each other off, and then going home and continue to destroy the planet. This happens repeatedly after every single one of these conferences. The other thing that happens is that rather than giving money, the money they promised they would, to these climate funds to assist developing nations in fighting climate change, instead, what these imperialist countries do is invest trillions of dollars into their own efforts to attempt to mitigate climate change. So instead of helping the global south and African nations that are again suffering the consequences of the behavior of the imperialist nations hoard the stolen wealth and figure it out and like focus on themselves, basically. We steal from you and we use what we stole from you to attempt to address climate change for ourselves. So yeah, the poorest nations, the African nations, the global south nations, who again represent a mere fraction of global carbon emissions, who are suffering the consequences of actions that are not their own, are left to fend them for themselves while that climate fund sits empty, and these wealthy countries are putting trillions of dollars into efforts to prepare themselves for climate change. In the case of the United States, like I said, they're focused on the military, they're focused on the empire, not the people. Meanwhile, when COP26, COP26 was happening in Glasgow, it was like Biden and, all those NATO leaders in the room together, jerk each other off. And outside, there were mobilizations and protests led by African and indigenous and colonized peoples from all over the world saying, like, this is a bunch of nonsense. We know what needs to happen. Let us in the room. Let's talk about actual solutions. Those people in the streets, those people representing indigenous nations, representing workers, representing peasant movements and women's movements and marginalized gender movements, they were locked out of the room. They were not allowed into the circle jerk. Instead, they were on the streets protesting the COP26 conference. The people who are on the front line of the catastrophic climate change crisis, who are feeling the most significant impact of climate change, who actually possess real solutions to deal with the problem, are systematically locked out of the rooms where the conversations about climate change are happening. So who those people represent are 1 billion children who live in the 33 countries who the United Nations have deemed extremely high risk due to the climate crisis. That's 2.2 billion, or half of the world's 2.2 billion children. They are also African and indigenous communities. They are working class and peasant communities. They are representing women. They're representing youth. They're representing the masses of people, the majority of the Earth's population, that are bearing the brunt of a crisis they did not produce. That is who is not allowed in the room when these imperialist nations are having their farce conversations about climate change. But those are the people who must lead the actual real response that's going to address climate change, the people who are being locked out. And like I mentioned, when these imperialist countries make their commitments that they have no intention of following through on, when they decide instead to hoard their resources to attempt to prepare their own countries for climate change, the solutions they focus on are a bunch of nonsense. They're focused on electric cars. They're focused on solar panels. They're focused on transitioning to a so-called green economy. But a green economy under a capitalist system is just going to mean more extraction, more environmental destruction, more colonization, more land theft. And that is what we are seeing unfolding in places like the Congo, unfolding in places like Chile. They tried it in Bolivia, but the Nazi people in Bolivia fought back. We are seeing these places where they have coltan, where they have cobalt, where they have lithium being targeted by imperialism, because those are some of the resources that are needed for this so-called green capitalist economy. So instead of colonizing and looting and raping and destroying for oil, which they're still doing, they're going to colonize and rape and loot and destroy for coltan, lithium, cobalt, and all sorts of other things that are needed for that so-called green economy. So the solutions that the imperialist system are presenting to catastrophic climate change, the green economy, the COP conferences, the commitments made, all of these things are not actually addressing the problem. They're just creating a new kind of problem. Same imperialism, new resources. So that's the problem. This is where we find ourselves. We are in a bad place. People are suffering. People are dying. There's already a refugee crisis caused by climate change. It's happening all over the world. This is where we find ourselves in the present day. So let's talk about solutions. Like, what do we do about it? So, hold on, let me drink. I just need a break. So previously on the show, we've talked about a climate conference that was held in Bolivia, I believe in the 2000s, I don't know the exact year, 2010, called the People's Climate Conference, that produced this statement called the People's Agreement of Cochabamba. We talked about it on the show before, but it was produced at the World People's Conference on Climate Change and the Rights of Mother Earth that was held April 22nd, 2010 in Cochabamba, Bolivia. That's that agreement. But we talked about it in the show before. And one thing about that conference that you should know is that it was a gathering of indigenous and colonized peoples who were on the front lines of the climate crisis, who came together in Bolivia to talk about what we can do from an indigenous people's perspective to address climate change. So I just put the text of the full agreement in the chat, and I'm certainly not going to read that whole thing because it's very long, but I want to talk about some of the major themes of that document because it's a clear path forward for us, those of us fighting for social justice, those of us fighting to address climate change. So some of the major themes or like the major overriding theme that you see in that document, is an understanding of the planet we live on as a living being that we as humans have a duty to. An understanding that the earth is not a resource to be exploited, but instead a living being that has as much of a right to life as we do. This is a very, very different understanding than how the earth is treated under capitalism. Under capitalism, the earth as an exploitable resource, if you drill so much, dig so much, extract so much, that the earth can no longer survive, then you just go to space and do it some more. That's how capitalism considers the earth. But at this World People's Climate Conference, they said no. The earth is a relative. The earth is a living thing. And this is not something that they made up at that conference. If you talk to indigenous peoples from all over the world, whether it's Turtle Island or Africa, you get a similar kind of mindset. An understanding that the land, the water, the air, the other creatures that inhabit this space with us are not resources to be dominated and extracted and exploited, but instead relatives, other living beings that we have a responsibility to. So that's an extremely significant shift in like mindset and understanding of the relationship that humanity has to the rest of life on this planet and to the planet itself. So that major theme kind of undergirds the entire rest of the document. They also talk about the necessity for maintaining harmony and balance between all things. They talk about the necessity of what they call complementarity, solidarity, and equality. The necessity of centering collective well-being, and the satisfaction of the basic necessities for all, basically from each according to their own needs, or to each according to their needs, from each according to their ability, like Marx said. They talk about how human beings need to live in harmony with nature, not seeking to dominate nature, but having a healthy symbiotic relationship with nature, like we actually did for like thousands of years before Europeans dominated the planet. They talk about how we have to recognize human beings for what we are, rather than what we own, another massive departure from capitalism. They talk about the necessity of limiting all forms of colonialism, imperialism, interventionism. And if you understand the planet as a living being, if you understand the need for solidarity and equality, if you understand the need to center collective well-being, then that obviously follows that we have to end these systems built on domination and extraction and exploitation. We have to end colonialism, imperialism, and interventionism to like uphold the principles this document is talking about. And then the document ends by calling for peace among the peoples and with Mother Earth. So I don't know, on November 27th, the Benson MS Brigade had our first conference, the Land Back Environmental Justice, or Cuba Land Back and Environmental Justice Conference. And on the Land Back panel, our comrade Julia from Global Action Alliance talked about how we need to transform our relationships to the earth, how in order to wage the kind of revolutionary struggles we need to survive catastrophic climate change, we are in need of a massive paradigm shift. And if you read through this People's Climate Agreement, you can see precisely what she's talking about expressed. That we have to transform our understanding of what it means to be a human. We have to transform our understanding of our responsibility to other living things on this planet and to each other. Capitalism has propagated an extremely toxic individualism that has taught us that we have to focus on accumulation and consumption, no matter if it leads us on a suicidal path or not. So what this document lays out is what that paradigm shift looks like. And starting from the basis of understanding that the earth is a living being that we have responsibility to is the first part of that paradigm shift. And so again, like I said at the beginning of the show, when you're living in the snakes and you're looking at Joe Biden being trash, drilling for oil, doing nothing, it's very easy to be pessimistic. But understand that the US and the capitalist way of dealing with the earth are not the only ways that exist. Indigenous peoples are currently protecting the majority of the remaining biodiversity on this planet. Indigenous ways of relating to the land and the water are still in practice all over the globe, including in the United States, including in Africa. Indigenous peoples already know what we have to do to repair this planet and to stop its destruction. They already know, and they're already fighting for it. They were out there in Glasgow fighting for it. So understand, like Biden and European or US empire and capitalist individualism are not the only options on the table for us. Other alternatives exist. They are currently being organized around, they are currently being built. We just have to join that fight. We just gotta join the fight. So that's the People's Climate Agreement produced at the World People's Conference on Climate Change in Cochabamba, Bolivia. Like I said, it's long, so I'm not going to read through the entire thing. Actually, one last thing I want to read, from this document. I get like congested when I talk a long time. It's because I'm not supposed to be doing this. I'm not supposed to be talking this much. But they, in the document, in the People's Climate Agreement, they talk about a universal declaration on the rights of Mother Earth. It's basically a Bill of Rights for the planet. It's so good. So in this declaration on the rights of Mother Earth, which is again about upholding the understanding of the planet as a living being and not a resource to be extracted, they say that the planet has the right to live and to exist, has the right to be respected, has the right to regenerate its biocapacity and to continue in its vital cycles and processes free of human alteration. Let the planet do what it's gonna do without human beings. Like now, instead of like stopping the drilling and extraction, they're talking about blocking out the sun to like lower the temperature. They're talking about trying to adjust the weather pattern. Like I'm just like, would it not be easier to just stop the destruction? Like why do you have to do this like stupid mad science? Like it's so irrational. Like capitalism is so irrational. I think they can like innovate their way out of any problem instead of addressing the fact that you're like stabbing Mother Earth. Like just stop stabbing her and see what happens. Don't try to block out the sun. What's wrong with you? So they say the right for the earth to regenerate its biocapacity, to continue its vital cycles and processes free of human alteration, the right to maintain its identity and integrity as differentiated beings, self-regulated and interrelated, the right to water as the source of life, the right to clean air, the right to comprehensive health, the right to be free of contamination and pollution, free of toxic and radioactive waste. Like when you start thinking about the planet as a living being, and then you start thinking about how they be like strip mining. I don't know if you ever see the strip mine, you should Google it. It's like really depressing. How they like just like will just like rake the earth to the root, just like taking things out, using enslaved labor to do it. Like if you think about like how they like pump like jet fuel into like lakes and rivers, how they like will like engage in like monocropping that destroys the integrity of the soil. Like if you think about the earth as a living being, and then you think about what's being done to it, it fills you with disgust. I don't know if you can see my face, but it's disgusting. If it's a living being, then what are you doing? This is monstrous. But these are the same people that were like testing makeup on bunnies and stuff. So, you know, it's like what they do. Like there's no respect for life. There's no like basic decency under this system. There's no bottom. There's no bottom. But in this statement, they're like, that's not right. Stop doing that. It's a living being. It's not right. And I really appreciate that. Remaining rights are the right to be free of alterations or modifications of a genetic structure in a manner that threatens its integrity or vital and healthy functioning. And lastly, the right to prompt and full restoration for violations to the rights acknowledged in the declaration caused by human activities. Another major recurring theme in this statement is the necessity of paying reparations that these imperialist countries, these capitalist countries that have destroyed the planet, that are forcing the masses of people in Africa and throughout the global south to suffer the consequences of actions they did not cause, have to pay, have to come up off those coins and help the planet recover and help indigenous and colonized peoples all around the world survive catastrophic climate change. So this agreement is quite comprehensive. I'll stop right there. I put the link in the chat. Please check it out. It is a very important paradigm shift. So, like I said, indigenous peoples have the way forward, but I want to talk about Cuba. At the beginning of the show, I played a clip of an interview from Fidel Castro where he's talking about how irrational and destructive capitalism is, how the way of life that capitalism produced, the level of consumption that capitalism produced in places like the United States is simply not sustainable, how we cannot replicate that way of living around the world, how it is not rational, how a better way must be built. or we are doomed. And Fidel Castro never gets credit for a lot of things in the United States. But one thing he definitely doesn't get credit for is being like an OG environmentalist. Fidel Castro gave a speech at the United Nations over 30 years ago where he got up there and he said, y'all are destroying this planet. The poorest people all around the world are going to feel the consequences of y'all's actions, but eventually no one's going to be able to escape. You're dooming the human race. This needs to be stopped. He said that the United Nations, he gave that speech. And he warned them in detail, and these people did nothing. But Fidel Castro was an environmentalist from way back. The Cuban Revolution was an environmentalist revolution from way back. And now we see that Cuba has transformed itself into one of the planet's most sustainable nations. And additionally, as we learned at the Cuba Land Back and Environmental Justice Conference, Cuba has a 100-year plan called Tarea Vida, Project Life, to address climate change. And this is what I mean when I say that we are not allowed to be pessimistic in the belly of the beast, because other ways of living are currently in motion. Better alternatives are currently being built. Tarea Vida is just one example. So the United States can't even plan like 4 years in a row. There is no centralized planning in the United States except to generate profit. Except for like imperialism and profit. Cuba, though, was like, wow, we are a small island in the Caribbean who are susceptible to flooding, more intense hurricanes, rising temperatures, and all of these things are going to have a drastic impact on our population and our land. What do? Let's do some long-term planning. And Tarea Vida is what they came up with. They planned 100 years in advance to address climate change. Don't tell me nothing can be done. Something can be done. The people you vote for just don't want to do it. Meanwhile, Cuba is planning 100 years into the future to address climate change. God, okay. So what is in Tarea Vida? Let's talk about it. Let me load this page so I don't lead y'all astray. Also, on the side of the conference again, I'm going to keep shutting it out because at the conference, during the Land Back seminar, we screened a documentary called Cuba's Life Task, Combating Climate Change. It's about 50 minutes long, and it basically goes into detail about what Tarea Vida looks like on the ground. I'm going to give y'all an overview on the show, but I encourage you to check out the video of the conference. You can find it on the same channel where you're watching this right now. Check out the video on the conference. Watch that documentary to learn in more detail about what I'm about to explain to you briefly right now. So Tarea Vida, which is Spanish for Project Life, was approved in 2017 by the Cuban government. It foresees a program of investments that will be executed in the short term, the medium term, the long term, and the very long term to address climate change in Cuba. So they got plans for 2020 and 2021. They got plans that go through 2030. They got plans that go through 2050. And they got plans that go through 2100. They are planning 100 years in advance. Man, socialism is the way. It's just the way, because long-term centralized planning is so much more rational than what capitalism has conditioned us to accept, where it's basically just like planning for money, planning for imperialism, no planning for life. So the main goals of Tarea Vida are to undertake actions and projects for adaptation to climate change necessary in 15 areas identified as most vulnerable. 2, to conserve and fully recover the beaches of the Cuban archipelago. 3, and an archipelago is basically like a nation that's made up of a number of small islands, which is actually what Cuba is. Number 3 is to ensure the availability and use of water as part of coping with drought. Number 4 is to direct reforestation towards maximum protection of soils. Number 5 is to rehabilitate the coral reefs as the most effective mangroves. And number 6 is to implement control and evaluate the adaptation and mitigation measures. I laughed at number 3, to ensure the availability to use water as a part of coping with drought, because I live in the Southwest United States. We are in what scientists are calling a mega drought. They're anticipating will last like decades. Also, rising temperatures which means that a lot of the food produced here is not going to be possible to grow anymore, which means that there's not going to be enough water for the people living here very soon. And there is no long-term plan. There's no plan. Meanwhile, Cuba's like, damn, we're going to have some droughts. How we figure out how to deal with this 100 years in the future? It's wild. Anyway, so for the areas that were identified as most vulnerable, particularly coastal areas, several measures are established by Tarea Vida. First, a ban on building new homes in the threatened coastal settlements that are predicted to have disappeared due to flooding. Second, to reduce population density in low-lying coastal areas. So they understand that the sea level is going to rise. They understand people are living there. And so they're like, how do we move those people away and then make sure that no additional housing is built there because it could be washed out to sea? Number 4 is to adapt agricultural activities to the changes in land use caused by sea level rise and drought. So like, okay, the land on the island is changing. The beach is going to advance more inland. The drought is going to change what can be grown where. So how do we organize our food production, organize our development to take into consideration these transformations of the land by climate change? Number 5 is to reduce cultivated areas close to the coast and diversify crops. So again, if it's too hot to grow some stable things, what can we grow instead? If it's too humid to grow some stable things, what can we grow instead? Doing that kind of research. Number 6, to plan the urban reurbanization processes of the threatened settlements and infrastructures. And number 7 is to start the process with lower cost measures such as induced natural solutions like beach recovery and reforestation. So again, that was some of the measures put in place by Tarea Vida, which is again Project Life, Cuba's 100-year plan to address climate change. And so what that looks like on the ground in Cuba is that they have engaged in trainings of entire neighborhoods in coastal areas in natural disaster response. When a hurricane hits in Cuba, the neighborhoods are organized and trained to immediately undertake a natural disaster response. When a hurricane hits the United States, it's chaos. It is chaos. Now in New Orleans, thanks to the experience of Hurricane Katrina, there are more and more grassroots responses, but it's not organized on a central level, and it's only happening in pockets. In Cuba, they have organized, again, entire neighborhoods in natural disaster response, in distributing supplies, in rescuing people, in engaging in recovery efforts, and engaging in rebuilding efforts. Cuban civilians are given training on how to do that. So when a hurricane hits, they don't have to wait for the federal government to send help like we do in the United States. They can immediately get to work helping each other. They plan ahead and they organize and prepare the people to address it because they know it's coming. They have also engaged in massive efforts of reforestation and restoring biodiversity. Like mentioned in the Tarea Vida plan, this is an attempt not just to lower carbon emissions, but also and greenhouse gases, but also to prevent flooding in areas where the sea level is rising. This is something the United States has still not grasped. Before European settlers paved over this entire country and built obnoxious and ugly cookie-cutter housing in suburbs, there were all of these like long natural grasses in places like Texas. Like Houston, Texas, floods continuously. Like every hurricane season, Houston floods. Before Houston was built, there were these grasses that were very, very tall on the surface, but whose roots would sometimes go like 50 feet into the ground. What that meant was that when the heavy rains came, the roots of those grasses would absorb the excess water. The Europeans didn't know what they were looking at. They stole the land. They attacked the indigenous people. They committed genocide, and they paved those grasses over. And so now when the heavy rains come in Houston, it's just concrete. It's just asphalt. It does not absorb water. The water just sits on top, and then these terrible houses get flooded. So Man, Cuba understands that you can use the land, you can use biodiversity, you can use the plants that are indigenous to that area to deal with flooding. If you just let them grow, if you don't pave over all of the things that absorb water, you can deal with the flooding. Oh my God, it makes so much sense, but the United States cannot grasp it. They have also, in many places in Cuba, that were destroyed by the plantation system of the Spanish and then the United States, have instead worked to replace indigenous species to like help bring them back, plants and animal life. And so I forget what it's called. I wish I could remember. When I went to Cuba with the Venceremos Brigade 2 years ago, they brought us to this area, this eco village, where they talked about how all of these species that they thought had been extinct were brought back once they deliberately invested in restoring biodiversity. All of these like plants and animals that had not been seen since before colonization all of a sudden are thriving in this area. This is like an intentional project of the Cuban government. And then also, we talked about, the sea level rising and how Tarea Vida says that, we can't build in those areas that we know we're going to flood. We got to make sure that folks don't live there. We have to make sure there's housing more inland. But when those people have to leave the coastal areas, the Cuban government pays for everything. Everything. They will pay for you to move. They will pay for your new house. So in the United States, when a forest fire that everybody knows is going to happen burns down your house, if you don't have insurance, you are just homeless and out of luck. That's it. U.S. government's like, damn, you should have planned ahead. In Cuba, when they know that catastrophic climate change is going to cause the sea level to rise, they're like, okay, this is who lives here. We got to figure out where they can go, and we're going to make sure that we pay for them to move and we pay for their new housing. So they are planning for the long term, and they are centering the needs of the people, the working people, not the military, not like, imperialist ventures, but the people that live in Cuba. Every single part of Tarea Vida is centered on life. It's centered on protecting the land. It's centered on protecting the water. And it's centered on protecting the people that live in Cuba. And this is a country that is much, 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 much poorer than the United States. This is a country that has been attacked by imperialism for over 60 years. This is a country that has been demonized in the U.S. press, in the Western media continuously. And yet we see this country, this poor country, this socialist country running circles around the most powerful empire on this planet when it comes to preparing for climate change. The difference is that the United States is a capitalist country with a government, a state, an economy that is centered around profit. And Cuba is a revolutionary socialist country that has an economy, a state, a government centered around life, period. That is the fundamental difference. That is why when hurricane season comes in the fall and we see places like Haiti, places like Dominica, places like Barbuda, places even like the Caribbean coast of Honduras where my family lives, we see them decimated. We see them destroyed. But Cuba is in the same region and does not suffer nearly the amount of destruction and life lost. And it's the difference between a revolutionary socialist society, an anti-colonial and anti-imperialist society, and a capitalist empire. All of these nations that get destroyed by these hurricanes are capitalist nations that are subordinate to Western empires. Cuba is a free socialist empire, and the outcomes are much, much, much different. So what does that tell you? That tells you that capitalism equals death under climate change, and socialism, decolonization, anti-imperialism equal life. The problem, however, is that Cuba is one small island on an entire planet, and the majority of that planet is capitalist. That means that even though Tarea Vida is an incredible project that is going to improve, it is already improving outcomes for Cuban people, that it's not going to be enough to save the planet. It's not even close. In that documentary, which again you should check out, in the conference, the Cuba Land Back and Environmental Justice Conference, there's a Cuban scientist that says, even if we pull this off perfectly, even if we accomplish all of the goals of Tarea Vida, it's still not going to be enough to save us. We need a Tarea Vida for the entire planet, is what he says. And that is the absolute truth. Is the absolute truth. We need a global paradigm shift. We need a global understanding of the planet as a living being. We need a global movement to destroy the capitalist-imperialist system and build socialism. We need all hands on deck to do this. If we don't do it, then yes, we are doomed. But Cuba and the indigenous peoples and African and colonized people all around the world are showing us that a better way of life is possible, a better way of life is in existence, but we, especially those of us in the belly of the beast, need to join them to build that on a global scale. It's the only way out. It is the only way out. So I want to read this quote by the GOAT, Evo Morales, where he says, and Evo Morales was the former president of Bolivia that was deposed in a US-backed coup, and then the masses of people in Bolivia were like, nah, and they pushed the fascists out, and they brought a new one in. But Evo Morales is like still a national hero. So he says, we are confronted with two paths, the path of Pachamama, which means Mother Earth, or the path of the multinationals. If we don't take the former, the masters of death will win. If we don't fight, we will be guilty of destroying this planet. But again, it's the former president of Bolivia, Evo Morales. So what that means to me is that climate doom is useless. If you are a person living in the heart of the US empire and you're like, there's nothing we can do, I'm just gonna, swipe left on Tinder and watch Netflix and eat snacks, like, no. You're not helping, you're actually actively hurting. Because we are not yet doomed. We still have time. We can still win. We, in fact, drastically outnumber the people who are destroying this planet. The issue is not that we are outnumbered or even that we are outgunned. The issue is that we are disorganized. Better alternatives already exist and are being built, but they need our support. They need us to defend them in the case of Cuba, in the case of indigenous peoples fighting for land and water back, but they also need us to be actively engaged in the fight to build a better world, which means being members of organizations fighting to build revolutionary socialism, fighting to build one unified socialist Africa, fighting for land back. If you are a person who is in no organization whatsoever, talking about we're doomed to climate change, you might as well just join the Republican Party, put on your MAGA hat, because you're not helping, because you're not helping. I understand that it's very scary. I understand that it can feel overwhelming, but understand that there are enough of us who, if we were organized, there is nothing that could stop us from saving this planet. Every single one of us has to make our contribution to building this better world. If all of the people who understand that climate change is a real and deadly thing get active in the fight to destroy capitalism and build socialism and get the land back, there is nothing that could stop us. There is nothing that could stop us. You are not allowed to say we are doomed while doing nothing. Like, you're just not allowed to do that. And he's going to shake you like a baby, but not like a baby. That's rude. But and I'm also sure that there's hopefully no one watching the show that has that attitude. But I would encourage you, if you encounter a person who has that mindset, who's like, there's nothing we can do, then show them this show, or show them that People's Climate Agreement, or show them the Cuba documentary about fighting climate change, and help them understand that we can actually do this. We can do this. We just have to be organized. There's not enough people on the right side of this fight, period. So what we need is to take the land back. What we need is decolonization. What we need is revolutionary socialism on a global scale. And the only way that we get those things is by joining organizations that are fighting for those things. getting active in the struggle, applying all of the things we read and learn about to actual strategies to push this movement forward, period. The only way this planet survives is if capitalism is destroyed and socialism is built, and we can do it. We can do it. If Cuba destroyed, or if Cuba fought the Spanish Empire and the French Empire and won, or not the Spanish Empire and the U.S. Empire and won, if Haiti fought the French, the Spanish, and the United States and won, if Vietnam fought the U.S. Empire and France and won, if all of these colonized, if Guinea-Bissau fought all of NATO and won, if these oppressed people who were outgunned and outnumbered were able to take on empires and win all throughout history, then we can certainly do it now. With more technology and more resources than they ever had, we can definitely do it. Pessimism is a not acceptable option. We must be active in this fight because we can do it. I have no intention of dying quietly. I'm going to fight to my last breath to stop this process because I refuse to hand over victory to these enemies of life on this planet. Absolutely not. I am active in this fight, and I hope you will be too. Because there is no easy death on the path we're on. There is no easy death for any of us. It's going to be a lot of suffering. It's going to be very hard. But it doesn't have to be like that. We just have to fight. Land back, decolonization, socialism. That's all we need. And we can do it. So yeah, that's the PE section. Let me see what you people are saying. You people. There's so many comments. I cannot read them all. Sally Fu, shouting out the conference. I agree, the conference was great. Search for Cuba, Land Back, and Environmental Justice, and you will see the full video of the conference. It is 6 hours long, y'all. I do not expect you to watch all of that. But there's actually you can skim around in the video. There's timestamps to show you where to go to. So at the very least, I encourage you to watch the Land Back panel and the Environmental Justice seminar to see the documentary. But please check it out. It is extremely important. It's the conversations we need to be having right now. Emma says, U.S. out of Guantanamo. I am sure they are the biggest polluters on the island. Absolutely. The New York Times just did this horrifying feature where they talk about what the U.S. military base on Guantanamo is like. It's the worst. But I definitely actually recommend that article so you can see what the United States actually wants to do to Cuba. They want to recolonize Cuba. They want to overthrow the revolution. And they want to turn it into bumfuck USA. It's horrible. But check out that New York Times profile for shots of what Guantanamo looks like, because Emma is absolutely right. The U.S. military is without a doubt the biggest polluter in Cuba. Blah, blah, blah. Agroecology has to be part of the way forward. Absolutely agree. Houston is filled with concrete parking, and it did not used to be that way, and it did not used to flood. Now they got these constant flooding because European settlers don't understand how to live in harmony with the land. They never have. Same thing in California, as a matter of fact. Indigenous peoples used to engage in annual controlled burns to get rid of the dead growth, to make sure that forest fires wouldn't happen. They were engaged in very sophisticated acts of maintaining the forest in a way that was going to be in harmony with nature. And then Europeans came through, killed them, put them in reservation schools, stole their land, stopped doing all of that, and now we see the consequences. These forest fires that engulf most of the state of California on an annual basis. That did not used to happen when indigenous people controlled the land, because indigenous people knew how to take care of it. They knew how to take care of it, and these European settlers do not. So frustrating. It's so frustrating. The same thing in Australia, actually. The Australian people, the indigenous Australians were we prevented this for thousands of years, and then y'all are here for a couple of hundred and mess everything up, and now the whole continent's on fire. What the hell? Man. Anyway. Agroecology is a communal project, quite different from the individualist self-sufficiency we see in so much homesteading and even permaculture. Absolutely. Good point. I am so glad that contemporary revolutionary groups in the United States are finally centering climate change and environmental issues and intricately linked to our struggle for liberation. I absolutely agree, and we have to do it more. I feel people be talking about, even on the left, will talk about climate change as an extra thing. And I'm no, it's the future of the planet, y'all. There's no communism if there's no planet. You know what I'm saying? We can't build a classless and stateless society if there's no planet that can sustain life for that society. It's not going to happen. We have to deal with this, and we actually have the solution. We have the solution, so there's no reason not to talk about it. Okay, so yeah. Thank y'all so much for your comments and remarks. I know this chat was like bumping. I wish I could read all the comments, but I can't. So I appreciate y'all, and I hope you enjoyed that segment. And again, please check out that conference. The full video is on our channel. It is the Cuba Land Back and Environmental Justice Conference. Please at least watch the Land Back panel and the documentary so you can see more detail about some of the stuff that was discussed on the show today. But we're going to keep it moving because it has been 90 minutes. I'm so tired. Okay, so in terms of what's going on in New Mexico chapter, we have a brief update. For the chapter. First, this coming Saturday the 11th, we are having our December Pan-African film series. We're going to be showing a talk by Dr. Horace Campbell, where he explains in detail what AFRICOM is, why it is a threat to self-determination in Africa, and what we can do as Africans in the diaspora and on the continent to fight it. It is going to be very good. We're going to screen it. It's 90 minutes long to talk, and then we're going to talk about it myself, Comrade David, and Monica, so it should be a good time. Also, so-called New Mexico chapter now has members in Utah and in Colorado, and shortly we're going to have a member in Arizona. So coming soon, we're going to change the name because we're no longer New Mexico chapter. We are now Southwest US chapter. So stay tuned for that when we change our social media name and stuff. But it's actually really exciting to see the growth of the chapter, especially the pandemic. I feel like we tripled in size during the pandemic, and it's very satisfying. And the show was actually a big part of it. So shout out to the show and for adapting and pivoting when the circumstances on the ground change and still being able to recruit and grow. And that's on all of us in New Mexico chapter. This was a team effort to get to this point, and I'm very, very, very proud. Very proud. So now we're going to be HRP Southwest because we got members Utah, Colorado, Arizona, New Mexico. So amazing. But yeah, tune in for the film series and stay tuned for that name change. Very exciting. So closing, let's wrap it up. As a reminder, it's still a pandemic. It's still a pandemic. These people, Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, I saw someone call her Candy Corn Harris on Twitter, and I found that very funny. But these people are trying to tell you this is a pandemic of the unvaccinated. They're trying to put all of the blame for the continuance of the COVID-19 pandemic on vaccine hesitant people. That is a bunch of nonsense. It's a bunch of nonsense. The only reason that we are 2 years into this with no end in sight is because the United States, alongside other imperialist countries, has failed utterly both in its domestic and global pandemic response. They have extended and exacerbated this pandemic. It is on them. I personally am vaccinated and I got the booster. I encourage folks to get vaccinated and get that booster. However, even if you don't want to do it, it's not on you. It's simply not on you because this pandemic has never been under control in the United States at any point whatsoever. They have never known how many people have COVID-19. Remember when they were blaming Omicron on Azania? Doctors in Azania identified it first, and then Biden shut down travel to Azania. And then they discovered it in the United States, and then they found out it was in Europe first. This is the kind of useless intervention that the U.S. government has engaged in since the beginning of the pandemic, first under Trump and now under Biden. They do nothing but symbolic, useless, racist, and profit-driven things to deal with COVID-19, and they turn around and blame regular-ass people. It makes no sense whatsoever. So, don't listen to these people. It's still a pandemic for everybody. We still need to be wearing masks. We still need to be social distancing. We still need to be getting our vaccines if we feel comfortable doing so. Please do that. But understand that there's no end in sight. Understand that they clearly have no intention of organizing any kind of adequate pandemic response. As a matter of fact, if you look at the pandemic response under Trump and the pandemic response under Biden, under Trump we got stimulus checks, under Trump we got a lockdown, under Trump we got eviction moratorium. It was better. It was still bad, but it was clearly better. Under Biden, there's none of those protections exist. Everything's gone, and the numbers are the same. They're the same. So clearly, the U.S. government is not capable or willing to organize the kind of pandemic response we need to survive this COVID-19 pandemic and the pandemics that are guaranteed to emerge thanks to capitalist environmental destruction. So, if we want an actually humanistic and effective pandemic response, or a natural disaster response, or a climate change response, then we are going to have to build a movement that is powerful enough to either demand it or build it for ourselves. That is it, and that is all. There have been no more stimulus checks. There have been no more eviction moratoriums. There was never a rent freeze because these people are not afraid enough of us. Period. They have to be scared to not do what's right. They have to be like, damn, what are they going to do if I don't give them rent control? If I don't give them national health care? They gotta be scared because we are so powerful and they know there will be consequences if they do not show up in the right way. Period. And the only way you can do that is that we build a movement that is organized and powerful enough to demand or build those things, period, which requires that we all be active in organizations fighting for that, period. Period. We are not outnumbered, we are out-organized, and these people are playing in our faces. So if you would like that to stop, then get organized, and the best way to do that is by joining an organization, period. So yeah, still a pandemic. So this has been Weekly Pan-African News. We do this on the 2nd and 4th Thursday of each month at 1 p.m. Mountain Time, which means we're going to be back, not on the 9th, I don't know what day it is, but in 2 weeks on Thursday. We actually were able to do that interview with our comrade from East Swatini. So we're going to show the clip of that interview and talk about what's going on in East Swatini, aka Swaziland. So tune into the next episode for that. Also, it is Thursday, which means there are 4 new articles on Hood Communists. Check them out at hoodcommunist.org. Please read them. Please share them. Please discuss them. If you are an African, you strongly disagree, you're like, this is some bullshit, I don't agree, then write a rebuttal and submit it. We publish African authors, all African authors intentionally. So if you have a wild hair up your ass and you're like, this is wrong, and you want to write about that, then please do that and submit your article. But either way, check it out, hoodcommunist.org. We want to thank you so much for joining us today. Please stay tuned for some music and some flyers for upcoming events. Have a good day.
This is for Palestine, Ramallah, West Bank, Gaza. This is for the child that is searching for the answer. Wish I could take your tears and replace them with laughter. Long live Palestine, long live Gaza. Palestine, Ramallah, West Bank, Gaza. This is for the child that is searching for the answer. Wish I could take your tears and replace them with laughter. Long live Palestine. While we listen to tunes made by ignorant fools, Israel blocked the UN from delivering food. They bring in the troops and you won't even glimpse at the news. They make money off the products that we're quick to consume. And it's not simply a question of differing views. Forget emotions, this is facts, what I spit is the truth. Makes no difference if you're a Christian or if you're a Jew. They're just people living in different conditions to you. They still die when you bomb their schools, mosques and hospitals. It's not because of rockets, please God, can you stop this all? I'm not related to the strangers on the TV, but I relate, cause those strangers could have been me. Words could never ever explain the raw tragedy. It's not a war, they're just murdering more rapidly, and we're automatically supporting pure savagery. Imagine how you feel if this was your family.
Free my people, long live Palestine. We will never let you go.
Sing it with me now. Free, free Palestine. 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 Palestine remains in my heart forever. We stand for peace, times of war. We shan't surrender. Remember, it didn't start in this dark December. Every coin is a bullet in your Marks and Spencer. And when you're sipping Coca-Cola, that's another pistol in the holster of them soulless soldiers. You say you know about the Zionist lobby, but you put money in their pocket when you're buying their coffee. Talking about revolution sitting in Starbucks. The fact is, that's the type of thinking I can't trust, let alone Even start to respect before you talk. Learn the meaning of that scarf on your neck. Forget Nestle, Obama promised Israel 30 billion over the next decade. They're trigger happy and they're crazy. Think about that when you're putting Huggies nappies on your baby.
Free my people, long live Palestine. We will never let you go.
Sing it with me now. Free, free Palestine. 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 It's not just a war over stolen land. Why do you think little boys are throwing stones at tanks? And we'll never really know how many people are dead. They drop bombs on innocent girls while they sleep in their bed. Don't get offended by facts, just try and listen. Nothing is more anti-Semitic than Zionism. So please don't bring bad vibes when you speak to me. There's plenty of rabbis that agree with me. It's your choice what you do with this message. Don't get it confused, I view this from a human perspective. How many more resolutions have to be violated? How many more children have to be annihilated? Israel is a terror state, they're terrorists that terrorize. I testify my television, televise, I'm telling lies. This is not a war, it is systematic genocide. But whatever they try, Palestine will never die.
Free my people, long live Palestine. We will never let you go.
Sing it with me now. Free, free Palestine. 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 Palestine, Ramallah, West Bank, Gaza. This is for the child that is searching for an answer. Wish I could take your tears and replace them with laughter. Long live Palestine. Long live Gaza. Palestine, Ramallah, West